to CNN actual details of the Republican tax plan that could affect Americans for generations. House Republicans are still behind closed doors being briefed, but we refuse to wait for them. Our intrepid reporters have pried the information loose. Phil Mattingly on Capitol Hill. Phil, we've been waiting to learn these details. What do you know?
Yeah, that's exactly right. This is what matters. This is what determines whether or not things move forward. Not a 9-page framework, but the details themselves. Let me run through a couple of them right now because they are extremely important. On the corporate side, John, obviously President Trump has made no secret about the fact that 20% is the rate where he wants it at, not the 35% where it is currently. That will happen. It will go down to 20%, and it will be permanent, according to sources who have been read out summaries of what's going to be in this bill. And as you noted, House Republicans right now still behind closed doors. They're in about a 90-minute briefing about the contents of this bill. Let me go over to the individual side because that's what's going to matter to everybody who's filing their taxes every single year. We now have where the rates are actually going to be. Now, it's never been secret that this plan was going to shrink from 7 rates down to 4 rates in terms of the brackets itself. At the top rate, they will actually leave the 39.6% rate for individuals who make more, or for couples that make more than $1 million. For individuals, that threshold is $500,000. Now, that wasn't always going to be the case, but that's a recognition of 2 things. 1, they need money to pay for this plan, and 2, politically, saying millionaires aren't getting a tax break, at least on the individual side, is certainly valuable. Now, to start going down the list here, for those who get the tax rate of 35%, that would start at married couples at $260,000 a year, $200,000 a year for individuals. At the 25% rate, that would start at $90,000 a year for couples, $45,000 a year for individuals. There's also a lower rate of 12% where others would come in on that. I also want to talk a little bit about key things that people like. We've heard a lot about the state and local tax deduction. Obviously, a lot of Northeastern Republicans have been very concerned about the proposal to repeal that entirely. The property tax element of that tax deduction will remain up to $10,000. So that is a give on House leadership's part. The big question is, will that be enough? A lot of Republicans from those states have said no. But we'll see. That's at least a give on something. The income side of that, though, that will be repealed altogether. There are a lot of different elements of this on the corporate side, on expensing for business investment, things that will sunset, things that won't last much longer than 4 or 5 years. There's a reason for that, John, and it's why this was delayed for a day. It's why Republicans have really been kind of working day and night to try and figure this out. With major cuts, like on the corporate side and on the individual side, it costs money. You have to pay for this. How do you pay for it? Well, you get rid of things that people like a lot. The home interest rate deduction, that's going to drop a little bit. Things like student loan write-offs, those types of things, those will start to go away as well. These are popular tax breaks. These are the things that people really enjoy. This is why tax reform is so hard. These details are extraordinarily important. Obviously, House Republicans behind closed doors being read out those details right now. In just about an hour's time, House Republican leaders will come out and talk about this tax bill. This is the first step, but make no mistake about it. They are not going to let this languish or hang out there. They know how politically difficult this can be. They want to move quickly. The House Ways and Means Committee will consider this bill next week. They want it on the floor the week after. The week it's on the House floor, Senate Republicans want to start moving their bill through committee. In all, John, they want to pass both in the House and in the Senate tax reform bills by Thanksgiving. Now, anybody who's been paying attention over the course of the last 10 months, things don't always move quickly, particularly over in the Senate. That's the schedule right now. But as I noted, there's a reason this was delayed for a day. This is very difficult. There are a lot of trade-offs right now, and there are a lot of very popular things that are on the chopping block. We'll see how House Republicans are able to stay together, kind of maintain at least the political imperative to move forward on this in the days ahead.
All right, Phil Mattingly, stick around. I'm also going to bring in Chief Business Correspondent Kristi Romans. But, Phil, before I talk to Christine, I just want to get exactly what you said about state income taxes. Will those no longer be able to be deducted?
That's correct. That will be gone. Instead, they will give a cap. What their give here, they wanted to repeal all state and local deductibility altogether, income and property tax. Property tax will now be capped at $10,000. That's a give. Income tax, that'll be gone. That'll be repealed.
All right, Phil, stick around because I have one more question to you on the political implications here. Christine Romans, you've been looking at these details. What jumps out to you?
What jumps out to me is you're going to see House Republicans really try to sell this as a middle-class tax cut, and you can see the language and the framing already and the messaging of that. So when we hear them at 11:15, that's what they'll be focusing on. They've given us sort of 4 scenarios, what typical families would the kind of tax break that they would make. Take a look at this. These are the new tax brackets, 39.6. That is, originally the plan was to get rid of that, and 35% would be the top top rate. So you can see for married couples who make $1 million, for $500,000 for individuals, that's where that tax rate would fit in. And that's because they did not want this to look like this was a little bit of middle-class tax reform and a lot of reform for rich people. I've been digging into what the numbers look like for companies, because this is really important. As you know, Democrats and Republicans and companies for years have been trying to simplify and lower the corporate tax rate in the U.S. from 35% to 20%, and they do that here. What I don't see and what was not clear yet is repatriating the money that's sitting overseas. Will they bring that back at 20%, that new tax rate, or will it be less? That's going to be key for corporate America. For you, for the average person, this bill says that you're going to be able to do your taxes on a postcard. That would be true simplification. That would be a true tax reform, if indeed it happens, and that's a political question for sure.
Yeah, to that political point, Phil Mattingly, to you, do we know if the House Republicans, the leadership, has the buy-in that they need from the Republicans in New York, New Jersey, and California, where these states have high income taxes that will not be deductible, which means that people who live there will effectively get a tax increase, or at least a partial increase on that front, and also with that property tax cap, which again may not affect as many people as they want. Do they have buy-in from Republicans from those states?
They don't, at least not as of yet, and that's why there's been a lot of late-night meetings over the course of the last couple of weeks. That's why the House budget, which is essentially the vehicle for tax reform, you saw a lot of Republicans from New York, from New Jersey vote against that. They were making very clear changes need to be made. Now, one change was made when it comes to property tax deduction, the cap on that. But you still have a lot of Republicans from those states who care about the income piece of it. They want to see more. They want credit, perhaps, has also been proposed. So this is still an open question, and it's not just on the state and local. There's a lot of other issues here, but I think it's worth noting this, John. There are 33 Republicans that come from what you would call high-tax states, where this really, really matters. House Republican leaders can afford to lose 22 total if they want to be able to pass this bill. So this is a real issue and one that they're going to have to iron out. Their final take was, let's put something on the floor. We can change it as we go through. When the committee marks it up, any type of floor action, things like that, changes can be made, but they still need that buy-in, John.
And Christine Romans, to you, home buyers, the various home builders associations have been concerned. What do you see in here that may either allay or fuel their concern? I
see here something really interesting. It preserves the home mortgage interest deduction for existing mortgages and then maintains that mortgage interest deduction for newly purchased homes up to $500,000. I'll be interested to see if the housing industry thinks that prevents people from moving up into bigger homes, if they think that that's going to have any kind of effect there. Also, the estate tax. I think politically this could be pretty interesting because it provides immediate relief from the estate tax, it says, by doubling the exemption. So that would be, I think, like $10 million, and then repealing it altogether after 6 years. There are really very few, every year, very few family-run farms, for example, that actually fall under this. So this is relief for some of the richest Americans.
Right. It's dozens of people affected by that, to be clear. You know, fewer than 100 at times. Phil Mattingly, I understand we just heard a round of applause coming from the Ways and Means Committee. President Trump likes to make a big deal out of any applause for anything, but do you get the sense that Republicans are pleased with where this is headed right now?
Yeah, I think that's true. And look, you talk about the work that went on behind the scenes here. There have been member-to-member meetings with leadership, with House Ways and Means Committee Chairman Kevin Brady. While they haven't seen the details, and they certainly haven't leaked us the details over the course of the last couple of weeks, there has been a real effort on one primary issue, and that is the overall economic picture of what this bill will present. The idea that whether you care about state and local or home interest rate deduction, any of those types of things, you can't look at it in isolation. You have to look at it in the bigger picture. And when you talk about cutting the corporate rate from 35 to 20, which Republicans care about deeply, when you talk about the individual rates going down for most people, when you talk about the pass-through rate for small businesses down to 25%, that's a huge issue as well. These are the types of things Republicans want. On top of all of that, and John, you know this as well as anybody, there is a political imperative to do something. Republicans came back a couple weeks ago recognizing that after health care's failures, after other legislative failures, they have to pass something. This would be a cornerstone domestic achievement. They are all in on doing this. The question is, can they get the details in the right place to get 218 votes?
All right, Phil Mattingly, Christine Romans, again, thanks so much for being with us. We'll let you get back to this plan to pour over the details because, again, everything is in the details right now. That is what will matter to these politicians on the fence, and that is what will matter to you, the American people, how it affects you. A lot of other news in Washington right now. The president perhaps interfering with the prosecution of the terrorist who killed 8 people here in New York City on Halloween, saying he wants the death penalty. Joe Johns at the White House for what we've been hearing. Joe.
John, human reaction, angry reaction from the president about a terrorist attack in his hometown. Nonetheless, the president is still the president. The question is whether this could affect a jury pool, whether this could affect a defense attorney who could raise some objections because the president of the United States weighed in. The president's also talked about Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, and sending this suspect there where so many combatants from foreign countries have also been sent. Let's read the tweets this morning. The president writing, "Would love to send the NYC terrorists to Guantanamo, but statistically that process takes much longer than going through the federal system. There's also something appropriate about keeping him in the home of the horrible crime he committed. Should move fast death penalty." So what that says to us is the president has sort of evolved from yesterday, where he said he would consider sending this individual to Guantanamo Bay. It's clear there would be some constitutional questions, some legal questions, because to our knowledge, no person on American soil has ever been sent to Guantanamo. It's just been people from other countries, enemy combatants who don't get their Miranda rights read. So apparently the president has sort of changed his mind. The question, of course, whether he is tainting the jury pool by expressing his outrage is something we'll have to hear in the weeks and months ahead. John, back to you.
All right, Joe Johnson, the White House, thanks so much. We are getting new details about the investigation itself. CNN's Alexander Marquardt has that. Alex.
John, we're learning a lot more about the planning that went into this and how much more carnage the attacker wanted to cause. The reason that we are learning so much so quickly is because the attacker has waived his Miranda rights. He is speaking with investigators. We know that the planning has been in the works for around a year, but it was only about 2 months ago that the attacker decided to use a truck to inflict what investigators say maximum damage. He likely looked across the pond to Europe and saw those horrible attacks that took place in places like Berlin, Barcelona, and London, saw how many people were killed, and decided to use a vehicle as well. We know that on October 22nd, so just under 2 weeks ago, he rented a similar truck from Home Depot to practice his turns, investigators say. Then on Halloween 2 days ago, he drove across the George Washington Bridge here on the west side of Manhattan and barreled down the west side, down that bike path, careening into pedestrians and to bicyclists. Now, right here across the corner, that's where he slammed into a school bus, and that's when his rampage came to a stop. He, at some point, getting out of the vehicle and going on a stabbing rampage. There were also 2 cell phones that were found, including one that had some 90 videos and some 4,000 photos that were associated with ISIS. His allegiance to ISIS in no doubt, John.
Alex Marquardt for us in Lower Manhattan. Thank you very, very much. It is a big day also in the Russia investigation. 2 key players being interviewed by the House Intelligence Committee. What are they revealing? Also, Paul Manafort, Rick Gates. Just in a CNN, one of the president's nominees could be in trouble because of the Russia investigation, or the nomination could be in trouble. Sam Clovis, who was a senior campaign official, we now know he has been speaking to the special counsel's office. CNN senior Washington correspondent, well, Joe Johns has this story for us. Joe.
John, Sam Clovis, as a lot of us know, was a very visible member of the Trump campaign. He was on CNN's air a lot, and he was also a high-ranking official in the campaign. He is now up for a job, nominated as the top scientist at USDA, the Department of Agriculture, but he's got a problem. We are told by a White House person who, with knowledge of the situation, that Sam Clovis may have to withdraw his nomination or be forced out, and that's because of his apparent connection to a man named George Papadopoulos in the Russia investigation. Papadopoulos, as we all know, pleaded guilty to a count of making false statements as a result of an FBI interview with him. And apparently, Clovis is one of the individuals who emailed and had other contacts with Papadopoulos, and among the topics of conversation was whether staff for the Trump campaign ought to travel overseas to meet with Russian officials. As you know, the investigation is into coordination of campaign efforts between the United States, the campaign in the United States, and Russia. So a possibility that Sam Clovis may have to step out of the way. His attorney says at all times Clovis strongly opposed any trips overseas by the aides for the Trump campaign. Back to you, John.
All right, Joe Johns in the White House will be watching that very closely. Meanwhile, more developments in the Russia investigation happening now on Capitol Hill. Testimony from two major players, the House Intelligence Committee behind closed doors with Carter Page as we speak. His connections to Russia go back years. The committee will also hear from a Russian who was in that Trump Tower meeting held by Donald Trump Jr., where he was promised Russian dirt on Hillary Clinton. CNN's Jessica Snyder has the very latest for us. Jessica.
A flurry of activity on Capitol Hill, John. So right now, Carter Page is talking with congressional investigators. He's of renewed interest right now because he's now admitted he exchanged emails with George Papadopoulos. And Carter Page said the topic in those emails of Russia may have come up, but that nothing major was discussed. Of course, George Papadopoulos pleaded guilty for lying to the FBI about his extensive communications with Russians while he was working for the campaign. But even before Papadopoulos' plea, Carter Page, he was of interest. He told the Senate Intelligence Committee that he did have brief interactions with low-level Russian officials in 2013, and that he even traveled to Russia at the height of the campaign when he was working as a foreign policy advisor in July 2016. So that was notably around the same time Papadopoulos was sending campaign emails saying that Russian officials wanted to meet with the campaign. Now, Carter Page has insisted he did not meet with any Russian officials during his trip. Of course, that will all be fleshed out on Capitol Hill today. The House Intelligence Committee also talking today to Ike Kavaladze. You'll remember he was the 8th person in the room for that June 2016 meeting at Trump Tower where Don Jr. was promised dirt on Hillary Clinton, but he says he didn't get it. Kavaladze's been investigated before for ties to money laundering. He also worked for the Russian oligarch Aras Agalarov, who arranged the Trump Tower meeting. And that company worked with Donald Trump on the 2013 Miss Universe in Moscow. So that's happening on Capitol Hill. We're also watching federal court where Paul Manafort and Rick Gates, they'll be in court this afternoon for their second appearance after pleading not guilty Monday. And it's interesting, now the Ukrainian government is sort of getting involved in this case. Ukraine's prime minister said in an interview with Canadian Broadcasting last night that Ukraine is willing to provide any information it has on Paul Manafort, although they've said that prosecutors haven't asked for anything yet. Of course, Manafort and Gates accused of laundering money that they made while working as lobbyists for the pro-Russian Ukrainian government of Viktor Yanukovych back in the early 2000s. So now Ukraine's prime minister weighing in as we await that court appearance a little bit later today, the second court appearance for Paul Manafort and Rick Gates. A lot happening, John.
All right, Jessica Snyder, a lot happening indeed. Joining us now, Republican Congressman Francis Rooney of Florida. He is on the House Foreign Relations Committee. Congressman, I will ask you about the Russia investigation in a bit, but first I want to ask you about the terrorist situation here in New York City and the investigation into that. Do you, sir, think our federal courts are up to trying terrorist suspects?
I do. I have confidence in our American system of justice. It's the leading light of the world based upon the Fourth Amendment and our Constitution. I'm confident that that terrorist will get the kind of trial he deserves and hopefully the punishment he deserves.
Leading light of the world, different than a joke or a laughingstock, which is what the president called it yesterday. The president also has suggested that he wants this terrorist to get the death penalty, which I am sure is a sentiment shared by millions of Americans, perhaps. The question is it imprudent for the commander-in-chief to say that out loud? Do you have concerns that it might taint a jury pool?
Well, no, I'm sure they can impanel a jury out of 330 million Americans to give this guy a fair trial, but hopefully he's going to get what he deserves. You know, we're all emotional, frustrated, scared, and tired of Islamically inspired terrorists wreaking havoc around the world, and I think the president's expressing that frustration right now. I certainly am frustrated. That's why I sponsored the RAISE Act, which would have kept this Uzbek out of there.
Well, you mean the diversity visa lottery is how he came into the United States, correct? How is it? He got in through that way. We don't know if he would have been able to get into the United States through another means. He was vetted, sir. So just explain how it's responsible.
If the RAISE Act were passed, people would be admitted to the United States on the basis of skills and a combination of talents rather than being a detached family or this diversity lottery, which absolutely, to me, makes no sense whatsoever.
And look, there are Democrats and Republicans who agree with you. Those who are negotiating as part of the Gang of Eight, we're going to do away with the diversity lottery. You know, the question is the lottery in and of itself responsible? But I do understand your point, sir. I want to ask you about the Russia investigation. The Wall Street Journal reports today that the Justice Department is considering charges against more than 6 members of the Russian government involved in the hacking of the DNC. Have you heard anything about this?
I haven't heard about indictments, but I've certainly heard about the DNC attempt and about the other Russian activity that's been on CNN and in the newspapers.
If the Justice Department, again, this actually isn't even part of the special counsel's investigation, if the Justice Department pushed for charges against specific Russians, that would show the severity of what went on last year, would it not?
Yeah, it would show the severity. Maybe they ought to push for charges against Twitter for admitting something they've admitted, that they suppressed the DNC leak. Maybe we need the fairness rule back. Maybe we need the fairness rule back to make sure that things like Facebook and Twitter are not biased one way or the other.
Well, look, Facebook and Twitter, they were up on Capitol Hill yesterday, and we listened to those hearings extensively, and they were pushed heavily on both sides for their practices. There are a lot of people that think that Facebook should have done more to step up in the way of some of these ads that went on. Do you think they should have done that?
Well, I think that needs some careful thought as to what kind of due diligence requirements to place on them. You know, you're a journalist. Journalists live to a pretty high standard of making sure they're telling the truth and they check their sources and things like that. But I don't know that exists with Facebook or Twitter.
Look, I think your concerns are shared by a great many people there. We're learning some of the details right now of the Republican tax plan that was just discussed behind closed doors. I assume you're in at least part of that meeting right now. I assume also you are supportive of this plan based on what I have read from you in the past. Are there any concerns you have of any of the provisions inside? Specifically, home builders are concerned about the caps on the property tax deduction. And I'm being sent emails by our business reporters saying that home builder stocks have tumbled since some of these details have started leaking out.
I think to accomplish the comprehensive simplification and reform that is the goal of the president and the goal of the Congress, and to achieve some kind of middle-class tax relief while we reform corporate taxes to stimulate capital formation, everybody's probably going to have to share a little bit of pain.
All right, Congressman Francis Rooney, thanks so much for being with us. Appreciate your time, sir.
Thanks for having me on.
The New York terrorist suspect talking to investigators, explaining how and why he picked his targets. That's next. Nervous, aggressive, that is how one neighbor describes the suspect in the deadly New York terror attack. The comments come as investigators reveal new details about the suspect, including that he planned the attack for more than a year, even rented a similar truck to practice his driving. Joining me now to discuss some of the political reaction, CNN law enforcement analyst Art Roderick, CNN legal analyst Paul Callan, and former senior director of counterterrorism for the National Security Council, Joshua Geltzer. Paul, I want to start with you. In the statements from the president overnight and this morning saying he would like to see the death penalty. I just spoke to Congressman Francis Rooney of Florida, who said, look, we're all emotional. We all have our opinions. He doesn't think it'll be a problem in court. Is it that simple when the president says things like this out loud? Can it complicate a prosecution?
Oh, it can complicate a prosecution. As a matter of fact, it could even prevent the death penalty from being administered. And I'll tell you why. There's an internal procedure in the Justice Department to determine which cases get death penalty recommendations and which do not. When the president, who's the head of the Justice Department, weighs in and says, I want that guy to get the death penalty, he's disrupted the entire process. And a defense attorney is going to come in later on and say, this is an unfair process. He's been denied due process because the president expressed his opinion to the people who work for him.
By saying it, he could work against the very thing he's trying to get. There is some irony there. The other thing the president discussed overnight and this morning is whether or not this man should be considered an enemy combatant sent to Guantanamo Bay. He backtracked off of that a little bit this morning, but the Attorney General Jeff Sessions of the United States moments ago discussed this and said he would like to still keep that in the arsenal. Let's listen.
Terrorists should know this. This administration will use all lawful tools at our disposal, including prosecution in Article III courts or at Guantanamo Bay, If anyone has any doubt about it, they can ask the more than 500 criminals whom the Department of Justice has convicted of terrorism-related offenses since 9/11. And they can ask the dozens of enemy combatants at Guantanamo.
So at this point, this is an academic argument, Josh, because this terrorist will not be charged as an enemy combatant. He's not going to Guantanamo Bay. But the Attorney General seemed to conflate two things there. He still said he wanted to keep Guantanamo Bay as an option, an enemy combatant as an option, but also bragged about the 500 criminals whom the DOJ has convicted. Those are two separate things. The DOJ convictions of the 500 people, that's an argument that some people are making for not charging as an enemy combatant.
That's right, and that seems to be the argument that won out overnight, and I suspect that's because the folks who work on these issues within government, who have the experience asking the question, how do we take a bad actor like this off the battlefield for as long as possible, those folks said to the president, here, the tool in your toolkit that you want is criminal prosecution. You want this in federal court where justice can be served, where a lengthy sentence can be imposed, and where there's been a ton of success in the past.
If you look at the Boston bomber, Jahar Tsarnaev, you know, he committed his crime and then was sentenced to the death penalty within 2 years. That's actually a pretty quick time for a death penalty case. Art Roderick, to you, one thing we did learn, which is fascinating and actually gets to this whole discussion about whether or not he should be charged as an enemy combatant, is this man waived his Miranda rights.
Right.
And started talking from inside the hospital. How important is that in an investigation, or how useful is that in an investigation?
That's very useful, but I mean, there's also the public safety exception to the Miranda rights where they didn't have to initially read him his Miranda rights, but since he's waived them, I mean, I think this just shows the bravado of this particular individual, that he wants to get his story out there. And we've seen this, you know, he wants to have the ISIS flag in his hospital room. He wanted it on his truck when he was committing this heinous act. So I think that's a key part of it. I mean, obviously they're getting a ton of information from him. I think the key part of this investigation, we're at the very beginning here. We're 3 days out. Initially, all we're working off right now is a complaint. I'm sure there'll be an indictment, a superseding indictment, as we move through this investigation. And I think this indictment that's going to come forward in the superseding indictment will have a lot more information in there regarding this crime.
Look, go ahead, Paul.
I just want to add one other thing, because the president has been concerned about the criminal justice system and being slow and not getting justice quickly. I was looking at the Gitmo statistics. You know, there are 5 people at Guantanamo right now who have been there for 16 years, and they were allegedly involved in the 9/11 attacks of 2001, who still have not gone to trial. The federal court system, generally anywhere from 1 to 3 years, your trial is completed. So if you want swift justice, he's in the right place, the federal court system.
And also there was a suggestion that somehow terrorists see the justice system here as not a deterrent. Well, look, this guy, by all accounts, or by all the evidence, seems to have wanted to die in this attack anyway. I don't think he was concerned about the legal consequences at all. Josh, there's something interesting that ISIS has not done in this case, which is claim direct responsibility here. We were talking to Julia Kayyem last hour and said that ISIS may not want to create too direct of a link to someone who is in custody and might be talking.
Generally, ISIS has been reluctant to claim responsibility when the individual did not die in the attack. And of course here, that's what occurred, the individual's in custody. I suspect on ISIS's part, there's some uncertainty with that. They don't know exactly what this person will go on to say, to be like, whether, in a sense, the individual could tarnish their image, at least as they see that image. And so there may be that reluctance, even in the wake of an attack that was successful insofar as taking lives, which, of course, the terrorist group encourages folks like this to do.
You know, Art, to you, a little while ago, we saw a picture of the school bus that was rammed by this truck driver, you know, dramatic video, pretty tragic.
As an officer, you have to be prepared for everything, and that's exactly what occurred here. They think they're responding to a motor vehicle accident, and in reality, they're responding to a terror attack. And this officer that stopped this individual is really a hero because he wanted to commit more crimes. I mean, there's even talk now that he wanted to drive onto the Brooklyn Bridge and continue this crime spree that he was on. And that officer did a very heroic thing and took this individual down pretty quickly.
All right, Art, Paul, Josh, thank you so much for being with us. Up on Capitol Hill moments ago, the Republican meeting where they're all learning the details of the tax plan just broke up. Lawmakers have been filing out of that meeting. they will start talking. We will start hearing from them, supporters and maybe some Republicans with concerns. That reaction from a feeding frenzy on Capitol Hill as Republicans react to the unveiling of the new tax plan. Of particular note, changes to deductions for state income taxes, property taxes, and your mortgage payments. CNN Sullivan Srifati up on Capitol Hill. New Yorkers, New Jersey, California, a lot of states in this country very concerned about that. You've been talking to some representatives. What are you hearing?
Well, the devil here is in the details, John, and that's what we're hearing from members who are putting their eyes for the first time today on this massive tax bill. They are being briefed by members of the House Ways Committee for the first time today. And as you see behind me, a lot of activity because members are leaving that briefing, giving us their first reactions on what they think. Now, from the leadership, we just saw Speaker Ryan leave, and from Kevin McCarthy, really trying to sell the momentum here, saying this is positive, going over well. And certainly from the outside of that briefing room, we could hear applause at numerous times throughout that briefing. But in talking to individual members leaving the briefing today, many still have reservations. They have concerns. They say, look, we haven't really been able to read this bill. It was largely crafted behind closed doors. We want to go over every detail before we can sign off on that. And we heard from, as you noted, many members from New York, New Jersey, those high tax states who still have concerns on one of the most contentious issues that has always been there, the state and local income tax issue. I talked to Congressman Dan Donovan from New York, and he said he's not sure if the deal that was struck to keep those property taxes in place but repeal the state and local income tax, he's not sure if it will be enough to win his support. Here's what he said moments ago.
I'm always concerned about the SALT deduction, the elimination of the SALT deduction. But we'll calculate to see if the AMT elimination is beneficial to the folks that I represent. Whether or not, because I live in New York City, our tax, property tax is lower than other parts of the state. Whether that's enough, I just don't know yet because we don't have the detail.
And what we're hearing from a lot of members essentially is that we're going to wait and see and read every detail here. One member calling it an opening salvo. The reality is that this is an incredibly steep climb. Now this opens it up to a larger process where potentially more tweaks could be made when they mark up next week. And it is, John, as you know, an incredibly ambitious timeline that leadership has set. They want this marked up next week on the House floor the following week, and then potentially move over to the Senate. A lot of back and forth. The end goal to have this on the president's desk by the end of the year, but certainly a lot of concern here. A lot of members saying we still have to actually read the bill to figure out if we support it. John? You
can see the wheels turning in Congressman Dan Donovan's mind right now because he's doing a calculation, and that's what's going to be so important. And just to put it simply, if you can no longer deduct your state income taxes or your property tax deduction is capped and your mortgage interest deduction is capped also, that can more than make up for a potential tax cut depending on where you live. So for some of Dan Donovan's constituents, it's possible. We don't know yet because they have to crunch the numbers. It's possible they could see a tax increase, in fact, rather than a tax cut. That's what Congressman Donovan has to look into right now. In Sunland, 22 votes, right? That is what Republicans can lose here. There are more than 30 from some of these high tax states that they're watching.
That's right, and that just shows you how really narrow their path is for this. They really can't afford to lose many of the members, and the congressmen and women that we've been talking about from New York and Jersey are a powerful group, and they pushed to make changes. They wanted to make sure that they would be looking out for the constituents, and as you said, it was really reflected in Dan Donovan's concern there that, look, the jury's still out here. I have to look out for my state, and we'll expect to hear that in the days ahead. John? Initially, some stocks were down. Home builder stocks were down the minute the announcement came out. That is one interest group here that we're watching very carefully. Other stocks, I'm sure, went up as a result. Sullivan Srifati, thanks so much. And coming up in just moments, Phil Mattingly will talk to the House Speaker Paul Ryan. He will talk about this tax plan, what is in the details, and he will push the Speaker to explain how much this will cost or how much it will benefit people in different states around the country. We'll bring that to you live when that interview happens. All right, Houston, we have a championship, an emotional night for the